Welcome back to the 49 processes of project management as documented in the PMBOK Guide 6th edition. In our first episode, we covered initiating, what exactly the initiating process group is. Now, a lot of people who study for this exam, they often say, Phil, I'm finding it difficult getting into the groove of things. I'm finding it a little bit hard knowing where I am. And I think the reason some people get lost and stuck is because the PMBOK guide is written by knowledge areas of knowledge, areas of specialty. Unfortunately, the exam is written by domain. So people aren't able to make the correlation between initiating on the exam versus where that is. And the best way to do this is to follow a double crosshatch approach. This approach was coined, double crosshatch, by a student of mine, Jerry, out of Virginia. And Jerry said, Phil, this is a double crosshatch. You've got processes going down that way, you've got processes going that way, you got to know both. Has to be a double crosshatch. Needless to say, Jerry Zapian, wherever you are, thanks for the term. It's come in handy because you got to do a double crosshatch. You got to go that way and that way as you study the guide. Okay? So I would recommend, if you are getting ready for the exam and you're only studying one way, you got to do both. You got to do both ways. And some people studying for the exam, they say, Phil, I'm stuck. I hate that book. I wish I had something else. And I tell them, don't worry, I've got the answer right here. You can come on board our course and you can pick up the Project Management Essentials book, provided you promise that you won't forget the mothership in addition. And they always laugh and they say, okay, we'll read the PMBOK guide, but a lot of them are so naughty. They end up reading just this and they end up killing the exam. But I tell them, hey, you are fortunate. You're fortunate, because I would highly recommend everyone read both a study guide and the PMBOK guide just to get used to the language, folks. Okay? So now we're into the planning process group. So welcome back. So those of you that were here for the first session, we stopped at initiating. We talked about developing the project charter. We talked about identifying stakeholders. And now we're on to the part where we talk about planning. If you fail to plan, you already know that saying, you've heard it, you plan to fail. So why don't we jump straight into it and see what the planning process group has for us. So the first process here may come across a little bit backward, unfortunately, because it says develop project management plan. But the truth is, the meat of the project management plan is not developed here. There are a few elements of the project management plan that are developed here. There's also some overarching planning that we should do to get a blueprint of how each knowledge area plan would be developed. So this is a little bit strategic in terms of how are we going to do every piece of this plan. How are we going to make the pieces align? Who's going to be involved in creating the subcomponents of the plan? Who is going to be involved in the baselining? This is where you're masterminding, trying to think, how are we going to get the overall plan developed? That is just one piece of this process. The next piece is the question, how are we going to manage change on the project? Let's put together a change management plan so that any change, be it schedule, cost, resource, contract, any change, we at least have some format for streamlining and integrating these changes, you see. So in Develop Project Management Plan, you're not developing the plan all at once. Boom, let's go. Hey, how comes the plan? No. That's not it. In this process, we are strategizing how are we going to develop all of the subsidiary plans. What will they look like? What will the baselines look like? It's an overarching concept of How will we do this at a high level? You're not going into the individual plans just yet. That's coming. This is an overarching strategic plan of how you're going to develop all the other components. But one of the components that you develop right here, right now, should be your change management plan, your change management approach, your configuration management approach. This is where you should begin to draw the line as far as this is how it's going to be, this is how we're going to stick to it, this is where the change control board comes in, or maybe it's we don't need a change control board. We don't need a CCB. It's going to be the project manager and the sponsor. Or maybe it's just going to be the sponsor or the PMO. Whatever it is, this is where all of that strategic planning for your overarching plan has to be done. So it's a little bit of a nebulous process. You know you're doing something in the beginning, but you may not have heard it like this because it's not spelled out like this. But I'm telling you, as you're developing a project management plan, you need to do some groundwork up front at a high level, and then you need to zero in to change. How are we going to manage change? All right? You need to have some streamlining done as far as the change management aspect is concerned. You also need to understand what your project lifecycle, what your project development approach will look like. All of this stuff needs to be done up front, and it could be done incrementally, but you do want to at least have a roadmap for how all this stuff will look, okay? Now, the other piece of developed project management plan is getting all of those subsidiary plans. Now, where are those subsidiary plans coming from? You see why I said it's a bit of a tricky one? Those subsidiary plans come from all of the processes that fall under this one. You see what I'm saying? So you've got develop project management plan at the top, if you look at page 25, and you've got so many tiny little plans or so many tiny little processes under it. Those processes are generating outputs that will contribute to subsidiary plans that will then become a feedback loop into this process called develop project management plan. So you've got an input to this process called outputs from other processes. There are a lot of other processes that feed this one. See? And that's why develop project management plan could take some time to wrap your arms around. But hopefully now I've given you a high level view of what it is. It's off to the races. So develop project management plan is where you strategize. How will this project management plan look like? What will our development approach be like? What will our life cycle be like? And then how will we manage change? How are we going to manage the configuration elements on the project? This is where you begin to put that plan together. And finally, when you've got all of those outputs from other processes, it is also in this process that you assemble everything together into one cohesive plan. I remember working for a well-known airline. They're now very well known. And working in that firm, we had tiny little components of our plan back in those days. This was not all digital. We had physical documents, that will all fit together in one final binder. Scope, schedule, the different elements fitting into one big binder. Think of it like this. It's in this process that big binder is filled. It's also in this process that we strategize, what's the binder actually going to look like? All right. So if you're looking at the picture that I was showing on the previous slide, you realize that we had lots of tiny little pieces. When we talk about managing time on the project, it's really schedule management, and you've got resource management, which now includes not just human, but equipment, materials, supplies, facilities, all of that stuff, and quality and communication. All of these tiny little pieces are going to make our big project management plan. So it says it's compiling all the smaller plans for time, cost, scope, risk, and other subplans into a singular master plan of sorts. So that pretty much is the summary of what happens in develop project management plan. If you go into the PMBOK guide, you can read a lot of the detail of what is in this plan on page 89. And I would encourage everyone studying for the exam, you want to go back to the mothership. You want to open up page 89 and you want to read what is in this plan. It will greatly help you as you prepare for your exam. All right, full speed ahead now. What comes next? After develop project management plan, we have a process known as plan scope management. Plan scope management is where we create a plan for how to define and manage scope and prevent scope creep. So this is where the team says, these are the processes of scope that we're going to carry out. This is how frequently we'll carry them out. We're going to build a WBS. This is how we're going to define our scope. This is how, this is when. So this is going a little bit deeper into planning before you begin to flesh out the knowledge area. So this is our plan for how to scope out the project and how to manage the scope of the project. The next process is collect requirements, and this is where we collect all manner of requirements: business, technical, functional, ethical, quality, so on and so forth. But remember, these are features and functions that you want to see in your product, your service, or whatever the result is. Now, after you've collected requirements, you can then take a step back and say, hey, what do we need to do to get these requirements in our deliverable? Wow, we've got a boatload of work we need to do. We need to do this, we need to do that. You said you wanted a requirement for this particular feature, this function. Well, guess what? This is going to take an additional, 50 man hours of work. This is where you begin to think about, what do we need to do to achieve that tiny little thing? Oh, we need to make a trip to the Atlantic. I often joke with my students when I'm training this particular process, and I tell them, imagine I want a chicken sandwich. What are the requirements for my chicken sandwich? And I let them have a go at guessing what my chicken sandwich will look like. And they say, oh, you want mayo, you want lettuce, you want this, you want that. And I say, keep going, keep going. And they get to the end and I'm like, you're not done. There's a particular requirement that could make or break this project. And if you do not glean that one requirement, you're finished. They say, what is it? And I say, I want everything from scratch. Lettuce to be grown from scratch. Don't go to any of those stores buying me lettuce from off the shelf. No, I want it freshly grown. Chicken, I want the poor chicken to be farm raised, and I want you to grab the chicken off from wherever it is, and sorry Peter, but you kind of get the idea. But everything from scratch, okay? It changes the entire project, because now you've got the passage of time and you've got additional scope. So Andy George, if you don't know who Andy George is, you could Google him, but he did a little experiment. He comes out with these videos of how to make everything, and he does this chicken sandwich project. How much would it cost to make a chicken sandwich from scratch? And that's very similar to this game I play with my students. But anyway, he discovered a chicken sandwich would cost upwards of $1,000. I think it came to either 1.5 or something to that effect. And he wasn't very happy at how it tasted. I think it didn't taste very good at the end of all that work. But it just shows you requirements beget scope. One of the requirements could be, I don't want you to buy salt from off the shelf. I don't want you to go to Famous Sam's, wherever you go to buy the salt. I want you to make it from scratch. My goodness, that means we have to schedule a trip to the Atlantic or the Pacific to get salt water. And then we've got to evaporate the thing. That's going to add an additional, 20 hours, however many hours it would take to evaporate the salt. And then look at the salt at the end of the day, trying to process it. All of that stuff takes time. So what am I trying to say, folks? I'm trying to tell you that the requirements trigger scope. And I hope that now I've talked about this funny example, you will remember whenever your trainer is telling you about defined scope, you remember my funny story about the chicken sandwich. All right, sorry animal lovers. It's just an example. Okay, create WBS. This is where we create a work breakdown structure. And it's a visual hierarchical breakdown of the project. And it clearly identifies what is involved in the project. It is like a family tree. You see the different levels of work from the top, known as the root node, all the way down to maybe the control accounts, depending on your organization, down to any planning packages, and down to the work packages. One of the mistakes people make with this, and I'll say on your exam, just beware, do not confuse the WBS with a schedule. Do not confuse work packages with tasks, because some people incorrectly call work packages tasks. It's unbelievable how people have a totally different idea of the WBS from what is. It is not a list of tasks. It is not a grouping of tasks. It is a higher level aggregation of all of these tasks into a work package, and those go into higher aggregates, control accounts, and ultimately that tapers into the root node. So if anyone's saying the WBS is a breakdown of tasks, they got it wrong. That could cost you marks on your exam, so you might want to watch out. The major output of Create WBS is something called the scope baseline, and that is exemplified on the screen. It's a combination of three things. Your scope baseline is your WBS dictionary, and your project scope statement. Moving a step further to our next process, we're going into the world of scheduling. So this process, plan schedule management, is where we plan how to develop and manage the schedule. Which software should we use? Should we do a release plan? Maybe we should use Primavera. Hey, Smartsheets is on the block. Oh no, let's use a Kanban board. Whatever you decide to do, you need to plan it up front. We don't just begin to use a project backlog or product backlog. We need to plan it up front, and it's in this process that we decide how the schedule will look and feel. The next process is define activities. This is where we break down the work into activities. We take our work package from the WBS, so all of those work packages for the different branches in your WBS are going to be broken out into discrete activities. It's a list of what needs to be done on the project, and it doesn't have to be in order. Similar to the post-it notes that you see on the screen, you could do it that way. You could ask your team, hey, what do we need to do to achieve this work package? And they give you a bunch of tasks, also known as activities in the world of the PMI. And our next process, sequence activities, is where we arrange the list of tasks in order of what needs to be done. What needs to be done first? What needs to be done next? And this is where we factor in dependencies. Oh, I can't do task C because it's dependent on a part from a supplier in task B, that kind of thing. Now, after you've got all of your tasks correctly ordered and linked with relationships and dependencies in mind, you're going to end up getting a project schedule network diagram, as they call it in the world of the PMI. You might want to look up network diagrams because on the exam, you could get questions that test you on topics surrounding network diagrams. Slack, same as float, leads, lags. You could also get questions on the forward pass, the backward pass. You could also get questions on free slack versus project slack versus total slack. So you need to know all these terms. And like I said at the very beginning, those folks who may be struggling, hey, we have a session coming up in August. Go to pmsucceed.com and learn more. That's pmsucceed and learn more. So going back here, we can see in sequence activities, we've got like a Gantt chart on this side of the screen, or a network diagram, if you will. But the bottom line is it's showing you that there is a linkage between task A and task B. There's a start-to-start relationship between task C and D. There's a finish-to-finish relationship between task E and task Z, for example. You can also see that we've got a diamond shape right there on the screen. What is that in the world of Microsoft Project? Milestones. Aha. So where did the milestones come from? The previous process that we just talked about, define activities, it gives you the activity list, the milestone list, and activity attributes. But that would be going into too much for today's session. But the more you read this stuff up, the more you'll see where it's used in subsequent processes. Let's move on to the next one. Estimate activity durations is where we estimate how long will each activity take based on the available resources. Wait a minute, based on the available resources. How do you know which resources are available? We are only in schedule management. We haven't even got to resource management. You want to know the truth about all this stuff, folks? It does not happen in a cookie cutter strict rotation fashion. There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of give and take between the knowledge areas. So just because scheduling comes first in the order presented in the book does not mean that in reality we're on a one-way street just doing scheduling and we're never going to encounter procurement, for example, or resources. No, we will. Because resource calendars is something we want to consider in scheduling, you see, but those knowledge areas do not appear until you have gone through chapter 6, 7, 8, then you get to 9. But that is not to say it's not happening at once. Let me show you a little secret in the PMBOK guide. A lot of people do not go to the last few pages in a book, but I want to show you a section of interest. A section of interest that I would like you to just flip open, take a look at, and it may help. This page is page 555. Now that's hard to forget because if you're not a member of the PMI, you know that's the amount you're paying for the exam. It's $555. So if you want to remember the page, just remember the exam fee for the PMP exam. But if you take a look at page 555 in the PMBOK guide, you see example of process group interaction within a project or phase. My goodness, have you ever seen that one before? Looks like a spaghetti diagram. Take a close look at the thing. You see that? Oh, maybe you can't. Maybe I should move back. No, you can't see it. You got to look at your book. I'm sorry. But if you look at page 555, you can see that there is massive overlap between initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and even closing is trying to overlap with initiating. What are PMI trying to tell you? They're trying to tell you that at any point in time, you should have your monitoring and controlling hat on. Your planning hat may also be on, and your executing hat. In other words, there is no fixed way that the processes and the process groups and the knowledge areas interact. One of my students said, Phil, I need you to just show me what happens first and what happens next. And I told this student, I'm sorry, if you look at page 555, it doesn't really help us that much. Another of my students, bless her heart, sent me an email a few weeks back, and she said, Phil, I'm trying to understand a particular data flow diagram in the PMBOK guide. I've got no clue what they're talking about. And truly, when I looked at it, it looked a little bit tricky, but I understood that she didn't understand because she hadn't really looked at page 555. If you look at page 555, it puts everything into perspective. You cannot think, schedule first, then cost. No. What happens when you do top-down estimating or analogous? And your CEO says, there's the money, run with it, make it happen, fit the schedule, fit everything into this budget. How do you do it then? You see? So we don't always get to pick and choose how to run the processes. Sometimes real life takes us on other journeys. And obviously the PMBOK guide as well is not in strict rotation, even though the chapters are presented that way. Okay, that's a very important one to grasp. Stakeholder engagement. You start thinking about stakeholders right from the get-go. You cannot afford to say, it's number 13 in the PMBOK guide. Let me think about risk first. You've missed the boat. Why? Because stakeholder tolerance levels and stakeholder appetites need to be thought about right there in risk. So if you're following that sequence of knowledge areas, you're going to miss it. All right, so page 555, very important page. All right, let's move on. So next process here is develop schedule. This is where we compile all the processed information into a final approved schedule with all the start, finish dates, times clearly defined. And then we move into the knowledge area known as cost. The first process here, plan cost management, is where we create a plan for how to estimate project costs. You'll realize the PMI do this a lot. They do this quite a lot. A plan for how to plan. Oh, create a plan for how to estimate project costs. Create a plan for how to determine the final project budget and control expenditures against that budget. All right, so this is some mega planning. Now, when you've planned how to manage cost, then you move into estimate cost. And this is where you're estimating how much each activity or group of activities, work packages, for example, will cost. So you're going through the information in a painstaking fashion. How much will activity A cost, activity B, C, D? Put all that information together in the next process. We call that determine budget. This is where we aggregate all project cost estimates into a final total amount to obtain the project budget. And this is the budget that we use to run the project. And we need to guard it very carefully. The next process is from quality. It's plan quality management. Now, when you're baking a cake for an individual that has a particular taste that he or she is looking for, you got to be very careful. You got to be aware of the quality standards and the quality levels and the specifics of that cake. That's what you do in plan quality. In plan quality management, you're asking the question, which quality standards are we trying to adhere to here? Should we be thinking about ISO or ANSI? Should we be thinking heavily about OSHA? Of course you should. So whatever you need to adhere to in terms of quality standard, be it internal quality standard, external quality standard, and government regulations that revolve around the quality topic. This is where you would identify them and you create a plan that identifies these quality standards that need to be met and how you're going to meet these standards. So at the end of the day, you've got a quality management plan that guides your efforts across the processes of quality. How are we going to ensure that quality standards are being met as we go through the project? How are we going to ensure that we don't have scrap and rework and waste and liabilities and lost business at the end of this thing? We need a planning. So after you've planned all of these elements in quality, you don't immediately jump into quality. There could be many things you think about. One of the things that's talked about a lot here is the cost of quality. And for your exam, know the cost of quality. Very important, you know the cost of quality. It's broken out into the cost of conformance and the cost of non-conformance. And that stuff, folks, you really, really need to know for your exam, okay? So after we get done with quality or plan quality management, if you go back to your page 25 and see what comes next, we're going into a different knowledge area. We're going into the area of resource management, all right? So let's take a look at this process known as plan resource management. What exactly are we doing here? In plan resource management, we are creating a plan for how to estimate and acquire resources and how to develop and manage the project team and ultimately control those physical resources. This is the how. How are we going to do this? You're not doing anything as far as acquiring them just yet. You're not even estimating them just yet, but you're saying, how do we estimate the human equipment, material, and supply resources that we need? When you get done with that, we go to another resource process known as estimate activity resources. In estimate activity resources, you are estimating the type and quantity of resources, human, equipment, material, man hours to be used on each project task. Now we're moving into a new knowledge area, communications management, but still in planning. This is where we plan our communications. Now, communications is one of those areas that we need to be very careful with, because it is often said the project manager spends 70 to, some people like the PMI say, 90% of the time communicating. And as a result of the volume of time we spend communicating, we need to do it right. We need to plan. We need to be intentional about how we communicate. We need to be intentional about how we grab our stakeholders' attention and effectively engage them. This is where it starts. It starts off with an impeccable communications management plan. Now, Professor Albert Mehrabian, Professor Emeritus from UCLA, he put together an experiment to find out how much of communications that's face-to-face is words. How much of it is tone of voice? How much of it is body language? Put together this experiment and he came away with findings that words were at the bottom. 7% is the words. What about body language? 55%. What about tone of voice? Tone of voice, 38%. So let's refer to this as the 55-38-7. The 55-38-7 is very important to PMs, because PMs know that people ain't gonna buy into what they're saying if they don't believe what they see. So as you communicate as a project manager, it is important that people see the passion, the care, the truth when you communicate. And that's what this is all about. It's about how do we communicate a message like this? How do we pass across information of this nature? Is it efficient to do this over the phone? And you say, no, Bob never gets it over the phone. I know my stakeholder. I need to sit down. We need to have the big old party. I need to go to his office and spend a full day to narrow down these requirements, or to iron out this change request. Or I need to go to Hilda's office to sit down for a whole week because she's always in meetings and we never get anything. It's good to know your stakeholders. That's all I'm saying. So in communicating, you really want to be thinking about these people you're communicating with, and you need to be developing a plan based on those stakeholders you know. And that's why the stakeholder register is important here, because the likes of Bob and Hilda need to be identified first, so you know who you're communicating with, and you can craft a plan, planning what, why, when, and how should we communicate to these stakeholders, to the team, people on the project, so on and so forth. Moving ahead here, plan risk management is taking us into a favorite knowledge area of mine. And if you didn't know, the PMI have got a standard set aside for risk. They've also got a standard set aside for other topics. They've got standards and they've got practice guides. They've got one for WBS creation. They've got one for scheduling. They've got one if you are into construction. They've got an addendum to the PMBOK guide for construction. They've got all sorts of stuff, you know. So if you're a member of the PMI and you haven't used your benefits of being a member, I advise you to go to that page where you've got all of those standards. Take a look. I'm sure you'll be glad you did. I mean, I have been extremely delighted in what I've received, you know, one for business analysis, one for program management. The list is endless, but you need to go check it out. But anyway, plan risk management is where we create a plan for how to manage risks. And for how to manage risks, we need to first identify, analyze our risks, and then we get into the monitoring of those risks. The word control is actually frowned upon. So to be more conservative, let's say we're monitoring our risks, because if everyone could control those risks, wouldn't that be great? So my buddy, the risk doctor, he's often telling me, Phil, we don't control risk, we monitor risks. So this is where we create a plan for how to identify those risks, for how to analyze those risks, and how to effectively monitor the risks. So it's the first process in this knowledge area. But taking it a step further, we're going into the identification of risks. So in this next process of risk management, this is where we are actually identifying the risks. This is where we're actually taking a look at what could be a negative risk, what could be a positive risk. And we're documenting all of this information in a risk register. And we're going to monitor this register all through the project. This is the beginning of a lot of work, folks. Risk is not for the faint-hearted, I tell you. Now, out of this process, identify risk, not only do we get a risk register, we also get a risk report. So this is huge. A lot of work goes into this process. Next, we get into performing qualitative risk analysis. On your exam, don't fall into the trap of thinking that you use the P times I matrix here. Let me say that again. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that you're using the probability impact matrix in this process. Are you? You are actually. I meant to say for quantitative. So in qualitative, you want to be in the zone of thinking that, oh, I am using my P times I matrix here. You see how tricky it gets? I didn't do that on purpose. This process, you do use the probability times impact matrix. In the next process that we're about to encounter that looks very similar to it, you do not use the P times I matrix. So it is something to be aware of as you study. Qualitative uses P times I, even though it's numbers driven. Quantitative, the next one we're about to look at, and people often muddle these up, don't want to muddle them up. In this one, we use expected monetary value. In expected monetary value, we're using dollars, we're using resource hours, we're using hard numbers. In the P times I matrix, we're using qualitative numbers on a scale. Could be a scale of 1 to 10, 1 to 5. But in this one, we do not do that. Okay? So this uses the P times I matrix. This does not. This uses EMV. So in this one, it says determining how much money or resource hours will be lost if a negative risk occurs, or what the gains will be if a positive risk or opportunity occurs. The next process is where we plan our responses to these risks. Should we avoid, mitigate, transfer, accept, escalate? What are we going to do? And if you're looking at the positive side, are you going to enhance, exploit, share, accept? And under accept, don't forget, you've got passive and active. So this stuff is important for your exam to remember as well. Moving on to our next one here, we got plan procurement management, and this is where we put a plan together for how we're going to procure what we need, if we need to procure something. So before that, we first need to do a make or buy analysis and say, oh, do we need anything from outside the firm? And if the answer is yes, then indeed, we put together our RFPs, request for proposals, IFBs, invitation for bid, whatever it is, depending on the nature of what you need, and you get it ready for the next process that we'll encounter in the next group. Next process here is planned stakeholder engagement, and this is where we create a plan for how to engage stakeholders and optimally control their engagement. And that, my friends, concludes what we were looking at. Again, don't forget, visit pmsucceed.com if you're looking to sign up for training, coaching for the PMP exam. Go there, take a look. We've got some incredible offers of materials and a curriculum that most folks should be able to attend, no matter where you are in the world, except you're somewhere very remote. But for the most part, folks in Asia Pac, people in Africa, people in North America, even South America as well, they should be able to join this virtual class. So it's going to be virtual, very similar to how we're communicating right now. At least I'm speaking to you. I can't hear you if you're saying anything. And speaking of communication, hey, how about chatting in any questions, any concerns that you have so that I can answer them before we hop off this particular section. So any questions, any comments, any concerns, anything I can help you out with? Going once, twice, and thrice. So thank you all very much. Remember, we just concluded just one of the sections. We have 5 sections to cover, and as we traverse this journey, I'll be reminding you, go back to the mothership. Take a look at what I'm saying. Try to find examples of some of these concepts that I've spoken about. Okay? So that concludes planning. Thank you very much for joining. We are going to be moving on to our next section, and that will be in about 15 minutes from now. So if you're watching live, you want to continue watching, just go to the Praizion channel. Don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't, because whenever we have these sessions, you get notified if you subscribe. Don't forget to hit like. Don't forget to share. Hey, one of my students said, Phil, I'm getting ready for the exam, but I don't want anyone to know because I failed the last time. I'm like, hey, so you ain't going to show some love to your buddy Phil by sharing your buddy Phil's videos with other people? Hey, don't do that. Share the love. Share the love. And she's like, no, I don't want to tell anyone I'm taking the exam this time around. I understand. I don't hold it against you. Anyway, thank you all very much for joining, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.